6:15 a.m., the 6th of August, 1945. Over the western Pacific, the B-29 Enola Gay departed Tinian Island, carrying a 4,400-kilogram block of metal codenamed Little Boy. Inside its silver casing lay 64 kilograms of uranium-235, a substance that, only months earlier, most of the world believed was uncontrollable. In the cockpit, Colonel Paul W.T. Tibbets sat still, hands on the control column, eyes fixed toward Japan. Outside, dawn light spread slowly across the surface of the sea. The bomb bay was silent, broken only by the whirring of fans and the faint tapping of the clock hands against glass. The co-pilot peered through the round window and saw clouds swirling beneath the wings. "Weather's good," he murmured. No one replied. In the mission notebook, the handwritten order from the 509th Composite Group Command stood clear. Target Hiroshima, a city of 350,000 inhabitants, untouched by previous bombings, is a vital military and industrial center. But to them, it was only a set of coordinates. At an altitude of 9,600 meters, the B-29 glided through the clouds, its right cyclone engines roaring as if tearing the air apart. Tibbets looked through the Norden bomb site, where the Ota River's winding curves appeared below. Beneath them, the people of Hiroshima were beginning an ordinary morning. Students pedaled their bicycles to school, office workers lined up for train tickets, and church bells rang softly across the river. According to records from Japan's Ministry of Defense, at 7:30, the first air raid siren sounded when radar detected an American reconnaissance plane, then fell silent. People assumed it was only a single passing aircraft. In the cockpit, Bombardier Thomas Farabee leaned forward to adjust the target in the sight. He spotted the T-shaped Ioi Bridge, an ideal reference point. Tibbets gave the order to open the bomb bay. Cold air rushed in. Farabee gripped the release handle, his voice unnervingly calm. "Bomb away." According to the Army Air Force's mission report, 509th Group, Little Boy was released at 8 hours 15 minutes and 17 seconds from an altitude of 9,467 meters. It fell for 43 seconds before reaching its predetermined detonation point, 580 meters above central Hiroshima. At that instant, the pressure gauge in the bomb chamber spiked, then went silent. A flash of light burst forth so white that human eyes could not react in time. As estimated by the Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory, the released energy equaled 15,000 tons of TNT. Within a 2-kilometer radius, everything vanished in less than 1,000th of a second. No rooftops, no human silhouettes, only floating dust glowing in the air. A surviving witness, Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, wrote in his diary, "I saw a light so bright, I thought I had been thrown into the middle of the Sunday. When I opened my eyes, the hospital was gone." On the plane, the crew looked out through the rear window. A mushroom cloud rose, swirling slowly like a living creature, reaching 12 kilometers high, its top swelling white, its base glowing red. Farabee exhaled, eyes fixed on the blazing column. "My God, what have we done?" No one answered. Tibbets later wrote in his report, "The flash was unbelievable. The city simply disappeared." When the second shock wave struck the aircraft's body, the Enola Gay shuddered violently. Tibbets tightened his grip on the controls. For a few seconds, the sky was so bright that one could no longer tell where the clouds ended and the earth began. Then darkness returned. Only a faint red haze stretched beneath the wings. In Hiroshima, according to the Japanese fire defense record, August 1945, the temperature at ground zero reached 4,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt steel and vaporize the human body. 10 minutes later, the B-29 turned back toward Tinian. No one spoke. The cabin smelled of hot metal mixed with sweat. A mechanic switched on the intercom, trying to make a joke, but his voice faltered halfway. Behind him, radar officer Leonard Cheshire recorded wind speed and pressure, his hands trembling slightly, as if afraid to touch the very data he had just created. In Hiroshima, survivors recalled hearing a deep explosion unlike any bomb before, and then a violent suction wind that tore everything apart. One woman remembered, "My house doors flew away, and I saw white light covering my hands. When I woke up, the city was gone." On the way back, Tibbets glanced at his watch, 9:12. The war was not yet over, but he knew the world had changed. No one in the cabin spoke aloud. Only the steady hum of the engines remained the heartbeat of the machine that had opened the atomic age. And in that silence, the war began to end. After Okinawa, in late spring 1945, the map of combat in the Pacific was no longer a sequence of easy victories, but a sequence of difficult questions. In Okinawa, Japanese forces suffered heavy losses, with more than 110 soldiers killed and about 40 civilians dead within the ring of conflict, but those figures did not turn the opponent into a negotiating partner. According to battlefield reports and logistical records, the fighting spirit of a portion of the Japanese command remained resolute, and the collective consciousness of defending the territory to the end forced Washington to recognize a new reality, that geographic victory did not equate to political surrender. The Allies' existing strategy encountered institutional and technical limits. Heavy air raids, incendiary bombing, and attacks by B-29 seconds destroyed infrastructure, but Tokyo still avoided losses sufficient to collapse the leadership's will to fight. According to an internal War Department document, a ground invasion plan named Operation Downfall was devised, the initial target being Kyushu and then Honshu, with staggering casualty estimates on the order of 250, 1.0000.000 Allied soldiers, not to mention civilian casualties and Japanese military losses. That was the number cited in strategic analyses, a figure both shocking and necessarily placed under an ethical lens when making decisions. The problem was not only the numbers, but the nature of the strategic and technical problem. Prolonged naval blockade, economic strangulation, use of incendiary bombs to destroy urban livelihoods, or increased high-altitude bombing all had effects but did not achieve the goal of forcing the enemy to surrender quickly. Time became an invisible enemy, because each additional week of the struggle was a week during which reserve units and civilians coerced into contributing to the war effort still presented themselves, and the expected losses of a ground invasion continued to escalate in both scale and brutality. In that context, strategists in Washington faced a grim choice. They could accept the risk of an invasion with enormous loss of life, according to internal estimates, or seek another means of striking, a blow fast enough to shatter the chain of command and sufficiently overwhelming to cause Tokyo to consider surrender. This was no longer a question of the most advanced weaponry, but a problem of time and ethics, of the trade-off between the lives of Allied soldiers and the lives of Japanese civilians. The mood in strategy rooms was tense, at times so quiet that one could hear the turning of paper, the silent scratching of pens, and the faint smell of cigarette smoke in the glow of desk lamps. An official responsible for planning reserved a line in the report, stating that they needed a finishing blow to avoid unacceptable losses. A military advisor looked out the window and said softly, "Time is eroding our options." That remark evoked a sense of compulsion rather than voluntary choice. The core challenge was thus distilled into a technical strategic requirement. There had to be a decisive strike, shocking enough to shake the leadership's will but avoiding the attrition of manpower inherent in a prolonged amphibious campaign. That requirement opened the way to considering and ultimately accepting a means previously unused in world conflict, a means promising to end the war in the shortest possible time, while simultaneously raising larger questions about the value and consequences of the very victory it would secure. In the summer of 1942, a middle-aged engineering officer with a broad-shouldered build stepped into the War Department conference room in Washington. His name was Leslie R. Groves, and he had just completed the construction of the Pentagon, the largest project ever assigned to the Army Corps of Engineers. When summoned to General Breon Somervell's office, he thought he would be given another construction mission. But when the door closed, Somervell spoke only one short sentence. "Groves, you're being assigned to command a scientific project. Top secret. Code name, Manhattan." From that moment, a field engineer entered a world where the only maps were equations of physics. At the same time, in Berkeley, California, a physics professor named J. Robert Oppenheimer was lecturing on quantum mechanics. He was slender, with a distant gaze and a mind sharp as a blade. During the 1,930 seconds, Oppenheimer had studied neutrons, electrons, and nuclear energy, but what haunted him most was Albert Einstein's warning that atomic energy could trigger an uncontrollable chain reaction. When word spread that Nazi Germany might be developing the first atomic bomb, Oppenheimer no longer saw it as a physics problem, but as a race between knowledge and annihilation. Groves and Oppenheimer met for the first time in Washington in October 1942. According to records from the War Department Historical Division, the meeting lasted only 45 minutes, but it determined the fate of the Manhattan Project. Groves arrived with a folder thick with documents, while Oppenheimer carried only a blank sheet with a few scribbled notes. "I need someone who can understand the language of scientists, but also knows how to command them," Groves said. Oppenheimer replied softly but clearly, "I think I understand, General. 2 men, 2 worlds, one forged of steel, one of intellect, were joined by a single ambition: to defeat evil with a weapon the world had never seen." According to an internal report from the Army Corps of Engineers, 1,943, Groves worked an average of 16 hours a day, signing hundreds of construction, transport, and recruitment orders. He demanded absolute security and personally approved every grain of uranium that left the laboratory. One engineer wrote in his diary, "He didn't need to understand the formula, he only needed to know it worked." Meanwhile, in Los Alamos, Oppenheimer assumed the role of scientific director, building an intellectual community that included such brilliant names as Niels Bohr, Enrico Fermi, Edward Teller, and Richard Feynman. They worked under immense pressure, surrounded by the desert of New Mexico, where the wind, the sand, and fear became constant companions. Many witnesses recalled that Oppenheimer possessed an uncanny ability to make others believe in what seemed impossible. During an April 1944 meeting, when scientists argued over whether the chain reaction could truly succeed, he simply said, "If we stop, Germany won't." The words fell silent in the room, yet they compelled everyone to continue. He did not shout slogans or issue threats. He persuaded with the eyes of a man who knew he was gambling with all of humanity. Groves was different. He was rigid, pragmatic, and believed that speed was the key to survival. According to the Army Corps engineering log, 1,944, he required every construction unit to operate 24 hours a day, rotating through 3 shifts, and he personally drove through muddy roads to inspect progress at the Oak Ridge plant. It was said that he always carried a stopwatch, recording every minute, as if each second of delay meant a life lost on the battlefield. What made them utterly different was precisely what made them work perfectly together. Groves needed a dreamer to make real what he could not imagine, and Oppenheimer needed a commander to turn theory into action. One believed in steel, the other in atoms, but both believed in the idea of a weapon to end war. In an internal address in 1945, Groves stated, "We are not seeking beauty, we are seeking an end." From opposite sides, discipline and intellect, they pulled each other beyond the limits of human capability. As the project neared completion, Oppenheimer wrote in his notebook, "The world will not understand us, but perhaps, because it will not understand, we may yet survive." A brief sentence, but it carried the entire weight of the 20th century. In an age when most believed the creation of nuclear power was impossible, these 2 men chose to step into history's blind zone. They sought not glory, but an escape. And when that door finally opened, the light of intellect merged with the darkness of war, leaving humanity with a lesson that has no answer. The Manhattan Project was not a small laboratory but a secret industry erected during wartime, where engineering, physics, and administration converged to turn the inconceivable into reality. According to project records, the total expenditure for the program was $2,191 billion in 1945 prices, and more than 125 people were mobilized, spread across 3 main centers, Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos. Each of those figures was not mere flamboyance but an indicator of organizational scale: factories, pipelines, reactors, laboratories, convoys, and an elaborate security apparatus. The scientific nature of the weapon rested on a simple theoretical principle, yet one so complex that it required a new industrial base to implement. The chosen material was uranium-235, an isotope comprising about 0.71% of natural uranium, whose fissile properties permitted a chain reaction. In a uranium mass reaching criticality, neutrons emitted by one fission would strike and split other nuclei, and the multiplication process would occur in a very short interval, on the order of 1/1,000,000th of a second, releasing an enormous amount of energy. According to calculations by the Los Alamos team, that energy was equivalent to approximately 15 kilotons of TNT, a figure engineers and commanders used to imagine the scale of destruction. Turning the idea into a weapon required two parallel solution tracks, producing fissile material and engineering a detonation mechanism. On the materials side, Oak Ridge was designed as a network of isotope separation plants, employing multiple methods, from electromagnetic separation to gaseous diffusion, and the S-50 plant was testing thermal diffusion techniques. Each process demanded enormous electrical power, material precision, and an uncompromising quality control chain. At Hanford, reactor systems were constructed to produce plutonium, an alternative pathway when scaling U-235 separation proved difficult. Regarding the weapon's structure, the Los Alamos group developed two design approaches, of which the uranium-235 device operating by the gun-type assembly mechanism was chosen for the initial weapon. The idea, relatively simple in concept, was to use two separate masses of uranium and fire one into the other to achieve an instantaneous critical mass. In execution, simple was a deceptive metaphor because simple here required extremely high machining precision, controlled firing velocity, and structural materials meeting stringent standards. Details such as core dimensions, the spacing between masses, tamper layers, and the explosive lens system were all calculated with complex formulas and then tested in models and numerical computations. The process unfolded not in the light but in absolute secrecy. Thousands of engineers, scientists, and workers lived in secured communities. They worked in shifts, signed contracts, and left the workplace as people returning from a vast construction site. No one was permitted to disclose the ultimate purpose. Many knew only that they were participating in a project to end the war. The atmosphere at Los Alamos was at once saturated with laboratory heat and heavy with a sense of responsibility. A technician recorded in his work diary that he saw strange drawings but never asked much, because the answers would lead to things he did not want to know. Precision was paramount. When one needed uranium pieces to come together in a flash to create critical mass, any error in weight, dimension, or timing was unacceptable. Thus, measurement and control systems were prioritized. Scales, machining equipment, and internal data links were continuously inspected. Those who worked there witnessed the numbers rise. Uranium output was ramped up through 1944 and 1945. Reactors at Hanford began yielding plutonium, and machinery at Oak Ridge operated at nearly 24/7 capacity. Ultimately, the enterprise was not merely material or equations, but the convergence of managerial skill and elite science. Groves organized the effort like a war-building corporation, and Oppenheimer assembled brilliant minds to solve the computational and design problems. Both elements were necessary, for without one or the other, the idea of a small, automobile-sized object containing the energy of thousands of tons of TNT would have remained a dream. Manhattan demonstrated that when knowledge and resources converge, the seemingly impossible can be made real, and that formed the basis for the forthcoming historical moment. Before dawn on the 16th of July 1945, the Jornada del Muerto desert in New Mexico was swallowed by wind and cold sand. Scientists and military officers stood in line inside a concrete bunker more than 10 kilometers from the detonation point. Atop a 30-meter steel tower, a metallic sphere codenamed the Gadget awaited activation. When the clock struck 5 hours 29 minutes and 45 seconds, The sky suddenly blazed as if torn open by another Sunday. According to the Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory report, the measured energy equaled 20 kilotons of TNT. The smoke column rose more than 12 kilometers, and the ground trembled within a 160-kilometer radius. Oppenheimer, standing behind a protective lens, raised his hand to shield his eyes and murmured, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." A line from the Bhagavad Gita, later recorded in his diary as an instinctive reaction to witnessing light not meant for humankind. It was said that for several seconds, no one spoke, only the sound of hot wind sweeping across the desert and the acrid smell of burnt ozone. A young engineer later recalled, "We knew we had created the power to end the war, but we also understood that the world had just lost something forever." 3 weeks later, that same light reappeared not in the desert, but above a sleeping city. On the 6th of August 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay approached Hiroshima at an altitude of 9,600 meters. When Little Boy was released from the bomb bay, the clock froze at 8 hours 15 minutes and 17 seconds. 43 seconds later, at 580 meters above ground, a fireball bloomed with a temperature exceeding 4,000 degrees Celsius, so bright that even people 15 kilometers away saw the sky flash white. According to the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1,946, 70,000 people were killed instantly, and more than 69% of the city's area was erased from the map. Survivors called it the light without shadow. A 4-year-old student, Shigeko Sasamori, recounted, "I saw smoke rising from my hands, my dress was burning, and my friend fell without a word. We didn't know what had happened. There was a sound, but no echo. At ground zero, human bodies vaporized, leaving their imprints on walls, stairways, and stone slabs. According to the Japanese Fire Defense Bureau, the heat melted window glass, bent steel beams, and burned the oxygen out of the air. Within minutes, fires spread and merged into a massive firestorm, swirling with the wind. From above, co-pilot Robert Lewis wrote in his logbook, 'My God, what have we done?' On the ground, Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, a survivor inside Hiroshima Hospital, stepped out from the rubble and wrote, 'I saw my city turn to dust while I could still hear my own heartbeat. Oh.' 3 days later, on the 9th of August 1945, while the world was still struggling to comprehend what had happened, another B-29, named Bockscar, took off from Tinian Island. The original target was Kokura, but thick clouds forced them to divert to Nagasaki. The second bomb, Fat Man, weighing 4,670 kilograms and containing 6.2 kilograms of plutonium-239, was dropped at 11:01, detonating at an altitude of 503 meters, with an explosive energy equivalent to 21 kilotons of TNT. Within the first, second, 40,000 people were killed, and another 60,000 were injured or severely burned. The city of Nagasaki, surrounded by hills, suffered the most devastation in the Urakami Valley, where the largest cathedral in Asia was completely obliterated. According to the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, the blast pressure reached 5 tons per square meter, destroying every structure within a 1.6-kilometer radius. A witness, Father Takashi Nagai, who survived inside a shelter, recounted, "I stepped out, and before me was a world without color. No sound, no movement, only hot wind and ash. On the ground, the wounded wandered among the ruins searching for water. Then, a black rain began to fall, raindrops filled with radioactive dust and soot." Dr. Fix. Hachiya described in his post-war notes, "People tilted their faces to catch the water, not knowing it was killing them. According to the Health Division report, 1,947 radiation measured at the center of the Hiroshima blast was 3.6 roentgens per hour, enough to cause bone marrow damage and acute radiation poisoning among survivors." At Tinian, pilot Tibbets returned to base, and the Enola Gay was serviced in silence. There were no celebrations, no victory banners. A mechanic remembered that night. Everyone sat around a table, staring into steaming cups of coffee. When his spoon touched the cold cream, He paused for a few seconds. The smell of milk made him think of the children he had just flown over. 2 days after Nagasaki, Emperor Hirohito broadcast Japan's surrender. Yet in those first hours, before the news spread, Hiroshima and Nagasaki remained cities of silence. In the final report of the Army Medical Service, September 1945, there was one brief line. At 8:15, the world entered a new age. The words were dry, but behind them was the sound of hundreds of thousands of hearts stopping at once. When the light faded, the ashes still floated, falling onto rooftops, into rivers, onto the hair of the living. The radioactive rain dripped on the hot stones, making faint sounds like the final breath of an old century. And in that moment, no one had time to call it victory. It was simply the end of sound. On the 15th of August 1945, Emperor Hirohito delivered his message of surrender over national radio. His voice was steady, slow, and almost whispering, but each word closed 2,194 days of war. The world exhaled, from the air raid shelters of London to the harbours of San Francisco. According to War Department communiqué No. 402, the war officially ended in the Pacific, concluding a conflict that had lasted 6 years, 8 months, and 17 days, the first truly global war of the industrial age. Within 72 hours of that broadcast, more than 3.5 million Japanese soldiers laid down their weapons across Asia. Bases in China, Indochina, and the Pacific fell silent simultaneously. In the United States, great cities overflowed with jubilant crowds, yet in Tokyo, smoke from the bombed districts had not yet cleared. According to the Japanese Home Ministry report, September 1945, the total casualties from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki attacks exceeded 200,000 deaths, the majority of them civilians. More than 70,000 others died in the following months from burns, bone marrow failure, and radiation sickness. For the U.S. General Staff, those numbers were seen not only as the outcome of a military action but as part of a strategic calculus. According to U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff Planning Memorandum 13/45, had Operation Downfall been carried out, the planned invasion of Kyushu in November 1945 and Honshu in spring 1946, Allied casualties could have reached 250,000, 1 million. An analysis by the Army Service Forces estimated that the Japanese would fight to the end, resulting in at least 5 million additional combined casualties for both sides. In that context, the decision to use atomic weapons was presented as a way to shorten the war and save lives. The comprehensive report of the Manhattan Engineer District History stated clearly, the immediate effect of the two explosions forced Japan's leadership to accept what they had once deemed impossible unconditional surrender. On the 2nd of September 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, Japanese representatives signed the instrument of surrender. President Truman issued a statement. The war has ended with a new chapter in human history. Yet in the offices of Washington, another chapter began, the chapter of atomic power. Following victory, the United States held a monopoly on nuclear weapons. In less than 3 years, it produced 9 more atomic bombs, improved detonation systems, and expanded the plutonium facilities at Hanford. The deployment of this technology was no longer an absolute secret, but the foundation of a new political status. Nuclear capability became inseparable from national prestige. According to the State Department Bulletin, January 1946, the United States regarded atomic superiority as the guarantor of lasting peace. But beyond America's borders, the notion of superiority began to take on another meaning. In Moscow, physicist Igor Kurchatov was assigned to establish the Soviet nuclear program. On the 29th of August, 1949, the first Soviet atomic bomb was successfully tested at Semipalatinsk, Kazakhstan. That 4-year gap transformed monopoly into balance, and the world entered a new phase of military history: nuclear parity. In the 1950 report of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, the term balance of terror was used for the first time to describe this condition. No one wished to fire a shot because every bullet could end all civilization. The impact of nuclear weapons spread rapidly beyond military boundaries. Governments began revising budgets, defense doctrines, and alliance systems. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was established, with nuclear deterrence, explicitly stated in Article 5 on collective defense. At the same time, the Soviet Union responded by forming the Warsaw Pact and accelerating the development of the hydrogen bomb, achieving success in 1953. From the explosions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a new era was born, one in which military power was measured by instantaneous destructive capacity rather than by the number of troops. Economics changed as well. Factories that had once served the Manhattan Project shifted to producing civilian nuclear energy. Under the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, the U.S. government created the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission to oversee, research, and regulate all nuclear activities. Within 5 years, more than 30 experimental reactors were initiated, giving rise to a new energy industry. Yet with that came anxiety about security and ethics. A passage in the AEC Annual Review 1947 admitted, "We have entered an age in which progress and destruction walk side by side." In the global political sphere, the image of the fireball over Hiroshima became the symbol of the limits of power. Leaders from Washington to London understood that they held in their hands a tool that had both secured victory and could annihilate humanity. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later acknowledged in his memoirs, "We won by intellect, but we also opened a door no one is sure can ever be closed." That statement reflected the profound transition from an era of total war to one of absolute deterrence. If past wars had ended with treaties, World War II ended with a physics equation. From 1945 onward, any conflict between major powers had to account for the nuclear variable. Balance of terror, a phrase born of fear, became the method of maintaining peace. According to the United Nations Scientific Committee report, 1956, during the decade following the war, more than 500 nuclear tests were conducted worldwide. The strategic impact of the atomic bomb did not lie in the two explosions, but in their existence. On the 15th of August, 1945, the war ended, but on that same day, the world entered a new form of conflict, the conflict of deterrence. Humanity learned to live with fear and called it peace. When the war ended, those who had created the power of the atom began to fight a different war, one against their own legacy. Marge, General Leslie R. Groves was honored in military reports and awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his command of the Manhattan Project. He appeared before congressional hearings, speaking in a dry, firm tone. "We did what had to be done to end the war." But when the lights dimmed, he spoke little. Colleagues recalled that Groves often sat alone in his office, rereading the records from Hanford and Oak Ridge, his eyes lingering on the numbers. For him, victory was measured in time, not in light. As for J. Robert Oppenheimer, the man who had stood in the Trinity desert and witnessed the dawn of the atomic age, he returned bearing a different burden. In 1947, he was appointed chairman of the General Advisory Committee to the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. Yet only a few years later, after opposing the development of the hydrogen bomb, he was removed from the National Nuclear Program. The 1954 hearing of the Internal Security Board took place in a cold, brightly lit room, with the scratching of pens and, before him, men who had once been allies. According to the AEC security transcript, Oppenheimer said, "I have seen the sin of man, and I want it to stop." After that session, his security clearance was revoked. The man who had opened the door to a new age was now pushed out of the very room he had built. The scientists who had worked with him at Los Alamos scattered across the world. Enrico Fermi returned to teaching. Hans Bethe devoted himself to civilian nuclear energy research, and Edward Teller continued to pursue the hydrogen bomb. Some withdrew entirely from academic life, as if the light had been too bright to face again. An engineer from Hanford later said in an interview with the Oak Ridge Oral History Project, "We won the war, but we lost the conversation with our conscience. While the creators wrestled with questions of morality across the Pacific, the survivors began their long journey of silence. The Japanese called them hibakusha, those affected by the atomic bomb. In 1946, the Japanese government recorded more than 140,000 survivors in Hiroshima and 70,000 in Nagasaki, many suffering from radiation burns, blood poisoning, and genetic damage passed on to the second generation. Dr. Shuntaro Hida, who treated victims in Hiroshima, wrote in his memoir, "No one died instantly. They disappeared bit by bit, from skin to bone, over many days. The spiral-shaped scars on their bodies became symbols of something humanity had never seen before, invisible destruction." In post-war Japanese society, many hibakusha were shunned, as people feared they carried a contagious disease. A woman said in an NHK Documentary Archive interview, "I lived, but I was not allowed to live like others. I am a memory people want to forget." Their images spread across the world, sparking peace movements and campaigns against nuclear testing. U.S. military cameramen recorded more than 16,000 meters of film in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but most of it was locked in classified archives for 2 decades. When the footage was finally released, the public saw for the first time the true consequences of a weapon they had known only by numbers. In those frames were burned hands, twisted rooftops, and children's faces that had no more tears. Yet the legacy of the atomic bomb did not end in sorrow. From its ashes, another chapter of science emerged. In 1951, the first nuclear reactor for experimental power generation was activated in Idaho, marking the beginning of a new energy era. Techniques for isotope separation, neutron control, and radiation shielding, originally developed for the Manhattan Project, became the foundation for radiation medicine, cancer treatment, and space research. According to the U.S. Department of Energy Review 1960, more than 60% of nuclear measurement technologies in the decade after the war stemmed directly from this program. Groves died in 1970, buried with the rank of lieutenant general. Oppenheimer passed away in 1967 in Princeton, not far from where he had once worked alongside Einstein. Shortly before his death, he received the Enrico Fermi Award from President Johnson, a belated gesture of recognition. During the ceremony, he was said to have spoken only one line: "It is good to have understood something, even for a moment." Perhaps that was his way of saying goodbye to the light he had once brought into the world. As for the hibakusha, they continued to live to speak in schools, museums, and international memorials. One man who had once hidden under a steel bridge in Hiroshima said, "We do not seek revenge, we want to be heard." His words echoed through the silent hall, where the young bowed their heads and the old wept. Human intellect reached its greatest height in the summer of 1945, but at that very moment, it learned its first lesson about limits. From then on, each time light flared over a test desert, humanity measured not only energy but conscience. In the end, that brilliance came with a price no unit of science could ever define. The light flared, then faded. It was a moment both brief and infinite, as if history folded upon itself in an instant and opened into another chapter. The atomic bomb ended a war that had lasted 2,194 days, but it also ushered in another era, one in which humanity lived alongside a systematic fear. Victory and guilt walked together on the same radiant path, and the question of the price paid became inescapable. There is a fragile line between what is called necessary and what is called right. When people measure by the casualty figures so often cited, planners see an immense equation, but on the other end of that equation are human beings with names, with sense, with memories. In a small gallery of a museum, dim light falls upon a pair of wooden sandals, a scorched set of clothes, and a faded photograph. The visitors are silent. Someone gently touches the edge of the picture, their hand cold as paper, and in that instant, history is no longer a number, it is a life looking back at you. Reflecting on the atomic bomb is not a lecture on technological progress, but an examination of humanity. The intellect poses the question: do we use this knowledge to protect life or to destroy it? When we look at the light of Trinity, at the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we see both the brilliance of thought and the long shadow of consequence. Oppenheimer quoted the ancient words, and Groves recorded the numbers, but those numbers, once they entered life, became faces and stories that cannot be measured in pounds, watts, or kilotons. There is an ordinary moment I always return to when thinking of this legacy. At an exhibition, an elderly man paused before a display board. He sighed, then set his spoon down on a cup of ice cream. The spoon touched the frozen surface, and he froze for a heartbeat, as if the taste awakened something long asleep within him, a memory of sirens, of prayers whispered before flight. That micro-reaction needs no explanation. It is proof that the memory of war lives in the smallest gestures, and that intellect, no matter how vast, is still bound to the beat of a single human heart. We must face this. Victory can save lives, but it can also take away identity, take away the springtimes of families. From the 6th of August 1945 to the 9th of August 1945, cities turned motionless in ash, and more than 200,000 people perished. That figure is a cold reality. But if we stop at the number, we fail to engage in dialogue with the past. The legacy of the atomic bomb is also a reminder of the living's responsibility to tell, to record, to listen. What changed after that flash of light? A new security system, doctrines of deterrence, laboratories shifting to civilian research, and international treaties emerging one after another to try to contain the uncontrollable. Yet alongside them are questions no document can answer. Who bears moral responsibility, and how can technology be prevented from mastering human will? When leaders speak of a balance of fear, they use the language of calculation. When families call the names of the dead, they speak the language of unquantifiable pain. I ask you this, reader, if your hand held the bomb release, if your command could end an invasion but at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives, would you give the order? That question does not belong to law or strategy, but to human nature, to conscience, to the ability to bear responsibility for consequence. It has no easy answer, yet it forces us to reconsider the worth of decisions in both war and peace. A message for those still young, for those who will inherit this history: keep memory alive. Do not let numbers blur the faces behind them. Listen to the testimonies of the Hibakusha. Read the diaries of doctors. Watch the plain footage of burned hands, bald heads of hospital children, and the bowed figures of the elderly before memorial stones. When memory is shared, lessons have a chance to spread, and the risk of repetition may diminish. If this story makes you pause to think, share it, bring others into the conversation, for memory only retains its worth when it continues. The image I carry is not the flash of power, but a thin layer of ash drifting on the river's surface, a faint light reflected in the water. The light of Hiroshima still lingers not to guide the way, but to remind us that intellect must be joined by compassion, or it will leave behind nothing but the ashes of genius. And in that silence we must choose what to remember and what to become. Have you ever lived through such days of war's devastation? Have you ever heard the wail of sirens in the night, or seen light flare and turn to dust? If this story makes you pause to think of the past, follow us and leave a comment. Tell me, have you experienced war, or heard the memories passed down by those you love? May stories like these never be forgotten, for every memory is a reminder that peace never comes naturally. One like from you can help those memories continue to be told, so that the light from the past may still shine upon today.